So we wanted to welcome Mike back today. This is exclusively on our YouTube channel, our discussion. We had a call with him yesterday. We did the show with him yesterday, and we just didn't have enough time. And in large part, it's because there's so much going on. And as we've been talking about, there's all these bills that are in place. The first week, you're going to have 500 introduced in the first week, which is relatively unprecedented. And it's just that there's going to be so much, and everybody's trying to catch back up and trying to get all the things done that they were trying to get done before COVID, and then all the stuff that they're trying to get done now. Some of it's really important to discuss. Some of it we could question whether or not it's that important to be introduced right this minute, but there's a whole lot. So Mike, thanks for joining us again and just continuing this conversation. I kind of feel like we might have to do this once a week with so much being introduced. So we appreciate it. So we talked about a few bills yesterday, and we just didn't really get a chance to do a deep dive on some of those. I wanted to ask you about, and we talked about a little bit before you came on, but there's this bill, consumer right to use natural gas or propane. I don't know that this is going to get a lot of traction, but I thought this was really interesting. Why would there have to be a bill that says that the consumers have a right to use natural gas or propane? Why is that even a thing?
Well, again, it's good to be here. And that bill is one that's in response to another bill that's coming that you haven't seen yet. And that bill that you haven't seen is called beneficial electrification. And
Right.
so what it is it for those legislators who want to get to 100% green energy, for example. So you're not heating your home or business with fossil fuels like natural gas or propane. And in full disclosure, I represent the Colorado Propane Gas Association. That's why I'm familiar with this bill. Mm-hmm. This bill is in response to that people should not have to be forced to switch their gas stove to an electric stove, their gas furnace to an electric furnace, their gas their air, any way they heat or cool their home or their business. Businesses should be allowed to use natural gas to cook food. And so and what we're seeing, and the city of Denver is considering that new construction not be connected to fossil fuel in any way. And so this bill by Representative Woog, a freshman legislator from Weld County, is in response to say, now wait, and to highlight the fact that this conversation is going on, because a lot of folks outside the Capitol don't realize that that's occurring. So if I think he would say, if you value that gas cooktop, that gas fire pit that you might have in your backyard, or the way you heat your home, or that you want to build your home or business with those fossil fuels connected to it, then you should have the right to do that, especially if it's inexpensive, cost-effective, and still Colorado is achieving their carbon and fossil fuel emission reductions. You heard the governor in the State of the State speech say that every utility, for the most part, 99% of them agreed they can get to an 80% reduction in their pollution, for lack of a better term. And so why would you take away people's right to do that? If you're achieving those kind of goals, you're on path to getting to those reductions. But I want to cook with gas. I want to heat with gas. I want to, I've never known anyone to roast a marshmallow off a light bulb, right? And so that is kind of the conversation that's going on around this issue.
I wish it was as simple as that. We've heard from a lot of folks in our area, because this is, it's not something that has passed by their notice. There's quite a few people. And I think the big thing is they're concerned about, especially as we're watching this happening in Texas right now, there is a lot of people in the Action 22 area, in these rural communities, that rely heavily on propane and natural gas. There was a big push, what was it, 15, 20 years ago, for everybody to go towards natural gas, and quite a few did that. But for a lot of these folks, they didn't. I mean, but they are on propane. And the propane people are incredibly busy right now. yesterday I told the story that the prices went up and my mom was worried. So in the middle of the storm, she decided that she was going to turn off her propane heater and just use the wood burning stove. And I think those are the kind of decisions that are made. I think it's, I don't know. This is incredibly concerning to me, and especially for our rural communities, that they would not have access to propane or that they would be forced into electric. A lot of these guys could not begin to afford heating their homes with just purely electricity.
Well, and it's a safety issue as well, because in rural and not even the cooking part, but a lot of people that live in the mountains, rural areas, they have a propane tank, and say you're tied into the electric grid, and we see what happened in Texas, they would still have some fuel storage at their house to keep their house warm if something like that happened. And if we're all electric, I mean, just the cost alone of switching that over is astronomical, but I think it's a safety issue for some of our rural members.
Absolutely.
Well, I think that the proponents, the sponsor of this bill, is introducing the bill to have this kind of conversation across the state and to raise awareness on both sides of the issue. There's not a beneficial electrification bill to respond to in terms in writing. So there's a lot of speculation. It is a priority, a beneficial electrification bill by the governor of the Colorado Energy Office. And so we just have to see what it looks like and what its impact will be. To put your mom's mind at ease, or folks that are in Action 22's footprint, my view is that beneficial electrification won't happen in a statewide approach. It'll probably happen within a Black Hills or an Xcel Energy territory, where those customers are regulated and there's redundancy in the services that they provide. So my guess is the proponents will want to take baby steps into this, but it's too early to say. The bill, I'm sure the representative will be glad to know that his intent has been met, where he just wants people to start talking about this because it's an important policy that isn't going to go away anytime soon.
No, I appreciate that. I'm glad. And anything that we can do is to further that conversation. We're happy to do it. It is a deep concern for so many of our people in the Action 22 area. So we touched yesterday, and I won't go back to this, but we touched a little bit yesterday on one of the things I think is really, really important, but you don't think it's going to actually get a lot of traction, these immunities for entities of COVID. Is there any negotiating or wiggle room on this, that they would do something that would give some immunity? Do you think, is there any way to make it a little more palatable for both sides on this?
I don't. And to be blunt, I don't know. The legislature, regardless of who's in charge and regardless of what year you're in, typically the first thing a legislator, regardless of party affiliation, will say, what's broken here? Tell me what we're fixing with this bill. And with so few lawsuits claiming around this issue, I got COVID at the grocery store or the gas station or whatever, so-and-so didn't do X right. I mean, I've heard of less than, 1 or 2 cases on this front. So I don't know. I know it's been a big issue in Washington, D.C., but from a Colorado experience, I don't know that it's that big of an issue yet. Doesn't mean that it won't be.
Right.
And so I think that we'll have to see more about what's broken here before I can tell you that a fix will pass. But just giving blanket immunity to the public and private sector on COVID, I think is a really high lift. And I think members of both political parties are both for it and against it. So I just think that folks who want immunity have more work to do to tell the story about why they need a change in the law.
Yeah. And we could see a year from now, this may be necessary. Absolutely. Next session. Yeah. This is kind of maybe getting ahead of it a little bit, but it's not necessary right now.
Yeah. Here's the other one that there was some discussion about last session, and it's coming back around again, and it's been introduced in both the House and the Senate, but they're broadband bills that would change the broadband board, try to expand services to make sure that broadband, what's broadband, what's not broadband. This is going to be a big discussion. And clearly, it's going to be a big discussion throughout the session. At some point, at some point you'd like to think that we'd have the broadband issue solved, but I don't know that that's realistic. So on the broadband, on changing the board, on all of those things, what are you seeing or what are you hearing? What would you recommend we talk about on that?
Well, what I urge Action 22 to do is to do what we're doing and to watch these bills, to talk about it, to see the reforms that have been implemented over the last couple of years, what's working and what's not. The bill that there's a House bill by Representative Tone that talks of different ways of mapping and different ways of distributing dollars and that type of thing. And I think that the Office of Innovation and Technology, that I understand is behind that bill, is really going to have to make an argument to the legislature that more needs to be done. And this is and that the dollars in departments like the Department of Local Affairs, most departments have the ability to get grant dollars out to local governments. Some question whether or not the Office of Innovation and Technology can do that in state government. So the conversation will be around, should we add another layer for local communities to interact with, or can we make the layers that are there better and integrate Office of Innovation and Technology? And the reason why this is important is if they're going to change the mapping and redirect resources based on new mapping from a deal that was made from a year or two ago, especially with new dollars coming in. The governor has asked for a total of this year of 140 million starting on July 1. But we don't know what's coming from the federal government related to broadband. Right now, the state government's budget is looking much better. In fact, in the year that we're in, the governor and the legislature think there's, I'm going to say, around $1.5 billion more of state money. And what you're hearing in DC is a conversation about another $4 to $5 billion of one-time money on top of that. So imagine a year ago being $3 or so billion down to now you've got almost $5.5–6 billion of money you weren't expecting. Most of that, understandably, one time. That's a really great position to be in. How much more should we put into broadband, and should we change the way we put into it, or where we're putting those dollars? That'll be the conversation.
So there was a couple of things on both bills that I really liked. One of them was that they were going to change the definition of broadband to make it bigger. So 10 and 1, I think they say 10 and 1, that if anybody's getting 10 and 1, they would be designated as unserved, which I think is a big one. I know that some of our friends are a little bit nervous about the precedent of being able to change the definition, especially when you're talking about federal dollars and state dollars, and you want all those things to align. But I think that's a really good thing. I don't know how comfortable I feel with reducing the size of the board. Like you said, I think let's rework what's there. If there's a hole there, instead of changing up how we do that. So I'm a little uncomfortable with that. But other than that, I kind of liked the direction they were going with the broadband. But definitely, if there's going to be that much of an increase, let's have some serious conversations about infrastructure investment, I would think.
Well, I agree. And I think what we need to do, again, is just make sure that we learn from our mistakes and that we fix them moving forward. And the deal from a couple of years ago was historic. And for the folks in rural Colorado, before that pot of money is diluted and move into places like, let's say, what we've learned from COVID, for example, is there are places in Aurora, in Lakewood, I live in Morrison, that you can't get the internet or it doesn't work as well. And so it is not just a rural issue.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Rural Colorado has been, in my opinion, overpromised and under-delivered to on broadband, regardless of who the governor is, Republican and Democrat, and that there's more to do there, plenty to improve on. But before we start messing with that, I think rural Colorado, people like President Garcia, Representative Escar from Pueblo, our new senator from Southern Colorado, Senator Coram from Southwest Colorado are going to ask the tough question about what are you going to do to get the rural connection done before we start talking about expanding it.
I love it. It's a good problem to have, I guess.
It is. And I think, again, these are one-time dollars out to be spent in a certain amount of time. So I think when that picture becomes more clear, watch the conversation. It'll be less about who's on the board, and it'll flip over to where are you going to put that money before the federal government takes it back.
Which is what it should be, right? Well, we'd hope. We'd hope.
Right.
Depends on who's on the board, I guess.
Right.
I want to skip down to one of the ones that I thought was really interesting. And I think they're trying to follow the lead of some federal initiatives, but SB 057, which is Private Lenders of Student Loans Act, and how they would change that up. And I know that you would probably have a little insight on this one.
There's a long conversation that historically has gone on by both Republicans and Democrats, but especially by members of the Democrat Party about, student loan debt and student loan interest rates that students really aren't, and students are of all age right now, especially in a COVID world. How many of us know someone old like me who's a student who's been unemployed because of COVID and they go back to school? And I think there are people that want to give more consumer protection in this space, that there's counseling involved to, you only need $1,000 to go to school, for example, I'll make it up, but someone's willing to lend them at a high interest rate $5,000. They may not need that full amount. So there's a large, what I'm going to call a cultural conversation around student debt and student loans. And that's all kinds of kids, right? Republicans and Democrats, it doesn't really matter. And this conversation, it will continue to go on until there's some relief. And you can see that in DC, right? Where some want to make community college free or all college free, or let's forgive a certain amount of debt, that type of thing, because of what some view as predatory practices in that student loan area. So this conversation, this is probably the third year that I can remember that this conversation has gone on, and it'll continue to go on until we continue to chip away and make sure there's consumer protection in this space. And that would be my prediction to you.
This was one that I found that was really interesting, and I don't know if you've done a deep dive on this one yet. SB 013, reversing COVID-related learning loss. And that was on our list to take a look at. I have no idea how you can quantify a learning loss to turn around and introduce something that would reverse that learning loss. Have you looked or done anything, a deep dive on this one?
I have not looked at this bill, but what I can tell you, and it's a good lesson for your viewers and your listeners and our members at Action 22, and that is sometimes you have a title of a bill, concerning, the color purple. And there might be other things underneath that are related to the color purple, but, aren't necessarily about a color. Does that make sense? So,
yeah.
So let me tell you what's going on with COVID related to schools. There's two debates raging right now. And as my kids are no longer in school, but for those who have kids in school, when can I get them in? How can I figure out what their learning deficit is? And what is my response to that deficit once it's identified, right? So getting schools open, you've heard the governor and the president and others talk about that. And again, legislators of both parties. And then there's going to be a big debate. There'll be a bill in committee that hasn't been introduced yet about the CMAS testing. Mm-hmm. So the big statewide test that should be done. There'll be a bill in committee on the 25th that has bipartisan support that says, let's spend more time in the classroom learning and less time testing. And because there are other mechanisms that are used in terms of daily testing and quiz, other standardized tests that can tell you where our holes are. And so let's suspend that test for this year and come back and bring it back in a year or so. That 2 weeks ago, I would have told you that bill would not pass. This week, I will tell you it has a better chance because more and more parents are calling their legislators and saying, you know what, the last thing I want is my kid feeling more stress about standardized testing, or I'm not letting them go to school. I'm going to keep them at home, and I'm not going to let them go to school to do standardized testing. That kind of defeats the purpose of what we just suffered through over the last year. So we're going to opt out of those tests so they don't really mean anything anyway. Right. And if I were to forecast for you, 80% or so of students across the state, I bet it could be even higher, are going to opt out of that kind of testing. And in full disclosure, I have 2 school districts that are clients, including Cherry Creek and Littleton schools. So we're pretty involved in those issues and wanting to empower parents to figure that out. So now that we know that there's a lot of smoke, there's fire where that smoke is around testing, what do we want to do to close those gaps? So underneath that title, this is where we started, we're going to have conversations, I'm sure, about testing and how to fund, again, because I'm old, I'm going to call it summer school. Mm-hmm. Some will call it a longer school year. Should we keep kids longer? And if so, how do we pay for it? If there isn't state dollars available, can we use some of those one-time federal dollars to keep schools open longer for this purpose of helping kids who need it the most? If you look at Cherry Creek's example on CMAS testing, one of the things that COVID did, and it doesn't matter whether you're urban, suburban, or rural, Cherry Creek gave away 14,000 laptops to let kids go home to do remote learning. To do CMAS testing the way it's currently envisioned, they would have to recall all of those computers back and clean them out and reprogram them, set them up for this online testing.
Oh my goodness.
That's insane.
That's a huge lift.
That's insane. So then when you recall those computers back to get ready for testing, then those kids have a harder time doing online or that blended learning. That isn't, again, an urban, suburban, rural thing. That's a Colorado thing. That's a Colorado problem. And that's what bills like this one are trying to figure out how to address. No one has the answer. Conversations are going on like crazy behind the scenes with your school, your superintendents, your school boards, your legislators. And I'm optimistic in another month or so, you'll see a compromise in this space.
What's the general consensus that you're hearing around school districts, school boards? Are they for putting off the testing, or do they want to keep it?
For the most part, your local school boards, your school superintendents are saying, let's not do any, let's waive CMAS, for example, for this year and come back next year and really focus not on in-classroom testing, but in-classroom learning. Because there are other ways, as I described a minute ago, about where are our deficits. We actually know who's behind what age, whether it's reading or math. And that's why school districts are already leaping forward to say, let's do summer school or a longer school year. We already really know. But there are lots of special interests out there who have a lot invested in testing. Mm-hmm. Whether it's education reformers or testing companies. This is the side of I'm going to offend people, but this is the side of public policy where special interests have a huge influence. And so what I would say to parents that are listening, call your legislator. Now that your legislators will be mad at me that I said that.
The numbers will be listed below the video.
Yes. Exactly. But let them know, in a respectful way that I want my kid to be in the classroom learning, or I want my kid to be I want to diagnose more directly or specifically what's broken here. And whatever your position is as a listener and a viewer, let your legislators know, because right now there are a lot of special interests are in there telling them both sides. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And just like you brought up the logistic part of it, working for a federal office for so many years, if we had to wipe 5 computers, we didn't have computers for a month. So imagine doing that for an entire school. That causes a lot of problems.
An entire district. There's 3 more I want to talk with you about before we let you go. One of them is the elimination of sub-minimum wage employment. Do you know about this one?
There's a larger conversation, and I don't know that the language in that particular bill will be ultimately what may pass or not, but with minimum wage requirements and whether or not we should be taxing tips, whether or not there should be different standards for rural communities versus suburban or urban. There's a larger conversation that is going to happen at the state level. I believe it's going to be wiped out and redirected depending on what the federal government may do in the next few weeks related to minimum wage. So that's one where I think the federal policy will rejigger this conversation about minimum wage and what gets taxed and what doesn't. So I think there's a bill title out there that will then respond to whatever the federal government does or does not do in this space. So I wouldn't spend a whole lot of time on that language as more of let's call the federal government the tail and the state government the dog, and the tail's going to wag the dog here.
Okay.
So the reason that we're particularly concerned about is one of our Action 22 members is a beautiful organization called Pueblo Diversified Industry, and they provide work, or they help find work to anybody with diverse skill set, but specifically anybody who's developmentally delayed or any of those designations. And so they do a beautiful job of helping them sort of live independently as much as possible by those jobs. But it's those jobs that we're concerned about, that if this happens, are they considering those kinds of organizations that do that great work?
It happened a few years ago federally, where you have an agency that takes mentally incapacitated, even they have programs for blind, deaf, and they contract, and it's like if you go to the hospital, somebody working at the cafe there. And the big thing with that, with their federal contracts, they had to pay a certain amount of wages, but their clients, or they call them consumers now, they don't make the minimum wage that's set by the federal government. And with this, just reading into it, I was wondering how that would impact these organizations and their employment of people that wouldn't be able to get employment elsewhere.
And we haven't had a chance yet to talk to the director here, who's a wonderful man by the name of David Pump. But we definitely want to have some input from him on this.
And make sure that the legislators are aware of.
Yeah.
And I think that's important, because the legislature isn't, it's my opinion that the legislature isn't and shouldn't just look at that particular issue by itself, because there are also conversations about, and you heard the governor talk about in the state of the state, maybe we should give providing up to $600 in tax credits for kids for up to 200,000 families in Colorado. Should we double the earned income tax credit, that type of thing? So when you look at fiscal policy like this, you have to thread all of those needles. Mm-hmm. And so it's important that we recognize and appreciate the effect that bill may have, but how does it play, and what is the cost related when all those other bills are added in? And what does their tax burden look like? Are they going to pay less in taxes to allow them to pay more of a minimum wage, especially for some of, I'll call them some of our special needs neighbors, that type of thing. So yeah. The bigger conversation that'll happen, I think the legislature will, it's my opinion, they'll look to wait to see what the federal government does on minimum wage, knowing that on a parallel track, we're having a larger tax policy conversation that will largely come to fruition, I'm going to guess, around the 1st of April to the middle of May in our state legislature.
We'll be watching that. So this was one that I wouldn't have normally paid attention to, but I've had some of our members come to us, and I don't think we had a chance to talk about this yesterday. I can't remember. The county authority to register for businesses, or register businesses. And I think one of the things that they were worried about, or the opponents of this, and this is SB 070. And I can imagine and I haven't had the conversation, haven't had the time with our CCI friends. I'm sure they're probably for it, but some of these businesses, they're worried about what it's going to mean for the county to to require businesses that aren't within a municipality to register on top of what they're registering with the county, or if they're not registered with the county, if they're like an ag business, or if they're any of those things, how they're registering. Have you dived in on this one at all?
This is one of those, it's like Groundhog Day. It comes back and back and back.
Yeah.
And this bill is actually being pushed by Adams County. It didn't receive enough votes at Colorado Counties Incorporated, or the Association of Counties, to have them undertake the introduction, as I understand it. But they really do want the ability to know what kind of businesses are in unincorporated areas. Years ago, when I represented the Sheriff's Association, this bill came up because we as Colorado, we regulated massage parlors out of business, right? And so Colorado Springs had, for example, had the right to say you can't have massage parlors in a city, in their city. So those things may pop up in an unincorporated area, and that might be a business, but you might not know that they're there. This would give county commissioners the statutory authority to kind of figure out where those businesses are. And that's probably not the best example, but it's one that one of the reasons why people look to bills like this. I think folks that are concerned about it might be folks in agriculture production or in fossil fuel production, that type of thing. And that's the risk that you take when you do a bill that applies to all 64 counties. And that's one of those things where the conversation is going to pivot to life exists outside of Denver or suburbia, the metro area of Denver. And so we want to make sure how it'll be used. The response to that concern is that it's permissive, so that the Los Animas County Commissioners they won't have to do this kind of registry if they don't want, right? So they won't undertake it. What does that mean for ag production in Weld County or in Adams County or oil and gas, for example? So it's just another layer of government to find out what kind of businesses are where they are. So people have to figure out where philosophically they are. It already passed out of its first committee, and I think it was on a party line vote, but don't quote me on that, because I would need to double check that. But it is moving forward. It is an Adams County bill. And I'm guessing over the next couple of weeks, people will catch up with their support or their opposition.
The libertarian in all of us do not like the idea of adding. We all have strong libertarian tendencies.
Well, your state government may know through a state business license or paying taxes. Your local governments may not always know, and so it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? So the question I think will be is, are there any protections for businesses put in this bill? And I think it's too early to say.
That's fair. That's fair. The last one, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, so I don't want to do too huge of a dive. And then there was one more that I just wanted to get some clarification because I don't understand it. We did talk a little bit yesterday about agricultural workers' rights and providing and we didn't get enough of a dive on it, but basically it's that it's unionizing ag workers, including immigrant ag workers. And I think there's some, we'll call it angst surrounding this, but would you talk just a little bit more about this? Because I had somebody after they listened yesterday to the show they listened on demand. They called or texted and asked if we talk a little bit more about this one.
Well, and I think the bill is very straightforward, and it's sponsored by Senator Joe Danielson from Jefferson County. And you would think, why in the world would a suburban legislator carry that? She grew up in a farm up in Weld County, and working conditions for her is very important, and that people aren't forced to work more than 40 hours, that they are allowed a lunch and a break, and those kind of a collective bargaining for rural employees at some local governments or state. Some local governments provide their employees, and that's what the conversation that she's looking to spark around the working conditions around those employers. I think the challenge that she'll have is it just farm? What about ranches? And what's next? Is it going to be a wage, beyond minimum wage? Are we going to get into what I'll call, someone described it to me, a prevailing wage conversation? And so there's a lot of concern because there aren't a lot of answers to these questions. And as I said yesterday, I think the sponsor is someone I've known for a very long time, and I think she's willing to sit down and listen to folks and take input. But we're not only seeing a bill like this, but I think there's a very good chance we're going to see collective bargaining for all municipal and county employees as well, local government employees. So that's a bigger conversation about workers' rights, in addition to what the voters have done on family medical leave and that type of thing. And there's just a strong element of our state and our legislature that want to put workers' rights on the front burner. And you're going to see more of that. So I think the bill is very straightforward. That's what her goals are. Whether or not she changes it or needs to or not, Senator Danielson, I don't know the answer to that.
We'll have to continue the conversation. So the last one I didn't understand was the PUC. This is 072, SB 072, and it's the PUC modernization electric transmission infrastructure for renewable energy. What's happening there?
I think that's a bill that's going to be very controversial, and I want to disclose that I represent Xcel Energy, who has not taken a position on it. But there are legislators who believe that in order to meet these massive emission goals that we talked about earlier in this show, for things like carbon and different types of pollution related to the production of energy, that you're going to need more green energy. And to do more green energy, you're going to need more transmission lines. Typically, I've been around a long time. I don't recall a utility ever using things like eminent domain to cite a transmission line. But this bill but even though they have that power, this bill creates an authority at the state level that, with the power of eminent domain, to cite power lines wherever they believe there is a market case to be made to do that. And so I believe that over time, traditionally local governments in rural Colorado have seen the development of transmission lines as economic development. And I think especially for Action 22, as energy production shrinks on the west slope, where's it going to explode? It's going to, from the lack of coal, it's going to explode in the San Luis Valley and in east and south and northeast Colorado and southeast Colorado. And so you're going to see a lot more transmission lines, and utilities are committed to working with people to do that and not using eminent domain. I don't know what this authority will do because it doesn't exist yet. So my guess is your county commissioners and others going to look at that and want more consumer protection, more landowner protection. If you think the pipeline fight has been severe in eastern Colorado and in southern Colorado, those things are buried. Imagine what it's going to be like with transmission lines everywhere. And so that's part of what Senator Hansen and others I'm sure will come and talk to you about and want to be a part of. But public financing of transmission lines, public ownership of transmission lines, eminent domain for transmission lines by an authority appointed by the governor. That's a big policy change for Colorado. And I think that's what the bill's proponents will have to come to Action 22 and to your constituents and make the case for. Because right now this bill is largely being driven by renewable energy sector, and out of look at the sponsor. Senator Hansen is a Denver legislator who will have to build coalitions to pass this bill. But I believe this bill, the more people look at it, will become more controversial.
Especially for our area, we know well that if you want to get everybody's seeing red in a big hurry, you start talking about eminent domain or takings, and they get really mad really fast. So that's going to be a good fight. So we don't want to take up. We could talk to you all day about all these issues, But I want to wrap it up with, is there anything that you really see that we haven't talked about that we're going to need to be prepared to roll up our sleeves on as Action 22? Regardless of whether, I mean, there's all kinds of rumors about what's going to be introduced or whatever. Is there anything that we need to prepare to gird our loins on, I guess?
For me, I think the big question mark out there is, what does the transportation bill look like? The governor talked about it in the State of the State speech. A local paper, I think it was today or yesterday, kind of called out Republicans to be involved, to come to the table to talk about transportation funding solutions, because then they won't have room to complain later on if the Democrats do something on their own. And I think that's a fair argument. And especially for our rural Republicans, who are obviously rooted in their values and their core principles, but rural Colorado has a lot to lose and a lot to pay in terms of taxes and fees if they're not engaged more directly in this conversation around transportation spending and the development of infrastructure. And that it should be a statewide plan, not just one that benefits, where the metro area of Denver, for example. I'll pick on them just because it's easy.
So easy.
But this has to be a balanced conversation of both political parties, urban, suburban, rural. You hear me say that an awful lot. But that way we can get away from bills that just benefit Denver and Boulder, right? And I get in trouble every time I say that with my legislator friends, but it is what it is. And so we need to have a balanced conversation on that. I will credit the president of the Senate, Leroy Garcia from Action 22's territory for doing just that, to really pushing members of both parties to come together to figure things out in this space. To me, that is the biggest wild card of this session, probably followed second by, the governor has talked about, and others, about needing, the voters in November reduced income tax by about 150, 160 million, give or take. The legislature wants to raise taxes or eliminate tax breaks for businesses to not only backfill that, but you heard the governor talk about, maybe we should give breaks to seniors on Medicaid. Maybe we should do double the earned income tax credit. So eliminate those tax credits on business to pay for those things. I will tell you what we talked about in the 2000s, the early 2000s, and I know people think I'm crazy, or maybe not your listeners, but when I'm standing in suburbia, when I talk about reducing the taxation on bull semen, right? People laugh and they giggle and they wonder about that, but if agriculture is special interest, then count me in.
Yes,
right.
We agree.
So if that, because they're small businesses trying to make it, and they're looking on how to compete with our surrounding states. We are not an island on tax policy, on transportation spending. And we want to be able to not only have a place we want to live and work, in my opinion, but that we can compete with those other states, so that we can attract and retain nurses and doctors and teachers and all the things that we talk about as a state. So tax policy related not only to how we're operating our businesses, but how we fund education is the big deal that is yet to be answered.
So on all of these issues, it's going to be the tax policy that we're really going to have to fight. And there's a whole lot of fights in a whole lot of places on that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And there are good people on this issue on both sides, right? And I do see Republicans, especially at the local level, county commissioners and mayors, that are, potholes don't recognize party affiliation, right? So they don't just flatten the Democrat tires when you hit them, or Republican tires. So we need more Republicans in the legislature engaged. We need to figure out what the solution is moving forward. It's clear the governor's going to keep pushing, and people like Senator Winter, Representative Exum, the chair of the transportation committees from El Paso County, he's a great guy to work with. They're trying to seek input from others, and we want to make sure that they get that input.
On the transportation bill yesterday, we hadn't seen anything on it yet. I assume it didn't happen in the last 12 hours.
Not that I know of, but there's lots of conversations to be had. moving forward. And I think you're going to see it really heat up over the next 4 to 6 weeks related to the state budget and tax policy.
So fun. Well, thanks, Mike, so much for doing this with us. Once again, I'm sure next week we're going to have a whole other list, but I think the big ones, the tax issues, broadband, the workers' rights, there's a lot of things on that. Just how we move forward in a positive and productive way. We appreciate all that you're doing and everybody that you take care of, including the Action 22 people. We appreciate you so much. So thanks.
Cool.
Thanks for being back on. So
Let us
we
know if you have
will
questions.
go ahead.
Let us know if you have any questions.
I will, and I'll have them. I can't stop asking questions. So thanks. So this again was just on YouTube. It's going to go straight to that. But on next week's show, we're going to have some really great nonprofit organizations that are working hard to get through COVID, and some of the ways that they're working with other nonprofits to get through this. We're excited to hear from Mike Riley and David Pump, who we already talked about on the show.
Yep.
And we will see everybody next week. Thank you so much.